Thanks, Helen.
That'll hook onto the genes.
Yep.
Thanks, Nick.
In 25 minutes, what I would really like to have done is just show you non-stop Ernest Henry core, and none of you would get bored. It's an insane deposit. I've had the privilege of working on it since 1993, when I was, one of my first consultancy jobs was logging the exploration, the discovery drill holes. So it was 27 years ago, and all that's really resulted in is lack of personal confidence about where my life is going. It's an extraordinarily difficult ore deposit. I haven't solved it. And so, 27 years, abject confusion. Anyway, so Rick's asked me to try and sum up what I've learned from that deposit with respect to exploration criteria, and I must also acknowledge the amount of support, starting with early days with Rick and Paul Gow, from MIM, Xstrata, Glencore for this work has been quite extraordinary. So what I'm going to go through very quickly, general IOCG characteristics, features of Ernest Henry that may or may not relate to exploration, and a few bits and pieces that have popped up over the years, some new stuff on magnetite geochemistry, how the orogenesis model relates to exploration, some aspects on alteration, metal zonation, etc., a few regional features, and then finally ending up with a little bit of work that John McClellan has done regionally, and he'll continue with a talk more specifically around Ernest Henry. Okay, so this is also with reference to Pat Williams' work, who started very early on in this terrain, looking at the IOCGs, and from that work built up this picture of what IOCGs are like globally, and Ernest Henry was well featured within this work. Most of you will know that Pat died last year from cancer. His Pat and Geordie Mark, they're in a fairly specific location. That location is the Walkabout Creek Hotel, otherwise known as the McKinley Pub. There had been a previous field trip there by Paul Hogan, and this is the slide that I think I probably have to omit from my official presentation because copyright infringement, I think, has been occurring at this moment. Okay, so fundamental ore body characteristics. We've heard a few talks, obviously magnetic highs, and I think it's probably fair to say that MIM, Xstrata, Glencore have pretty well drilled every magnetic high ever found on any of their leases. So magnetic inversions obviously continue to be important, but the proviso is you just can't be drilling every magnetic high because it's already been done, more or less. The shape of the ore body, most people will know, is a plunging pipe, and it continues to plunge. It's getting more interesting with depth, but the shape of that ore body itself, a south plunging thing, is one of the key features, and we'll take a look a little bit more at what's inside it. Now, this is just a hint of the core. For those of you that understand breccias and worked on breccias all their life, I hope you've seen Ernest Henry. It's just a very, very silly breccia. The silliest part of it is, first of all, I should introduce a couple of terms. Class supported breccia, matrix supported breccia, and you can see a transition here. You don't often see the transition over a few core trays from relatively intact rock that gets a series of veins through it and then turns into a class supported breccia, and then gradually as you get higher and higher grade, you end up with this matrix supported breccia. And a lot of the ore body looks like this, where you have about 50% of the wall rock clasts floating in a sea of ore. And if it's not supported by the clasts, it's a bit interesting as to how you do that. So this is hydrothermal, calcite, magnetite and sulfides that support clasts that don't touch each other. And that observation alone is the observation that every time I go back there, I ask myself, how does this work? And I still don't know. It's just a bit tough to think of 50% clasts sitting in 50% chemical cement where the clasts don't touch. How did it form? It kind of like, did it snap freeze? What? It's just a bit crazy. And even better when you look at the details of these breccias. So this is a lovely breccia triangle. It's a lovely breccia triangle in the sense that it was originally developed in caves, and it's totally non-genetic. And so it's one of the very few breccia classification diagrams. It comes from Woodcock and Mort. And for those of you into breccias, I recommend you chase this up. But it simply divides breccia classification into percent clast, percent cement, and percent matrix or microclast. And when they mean matrix, they mean microclast effectively. So you're basically dividing into chemical cement, small bits of rock, and the background host rock. And when you look at Ernest Henry and plot grade versus some of these attributes of the breccias, here's an example from EH438, quite close to 435 that was just mentioned. When you go from background rock into more percent, you get higher grade. Deeper in the ore body, the breccias become more complicated, but still you get this effect of going from background rock into more exotic looking breccias with an increase in grade. So there's two sets of processes occurring. One is basically cementation and one is progressive fragmentation and grinding. And those two processes are intimately associated with ore. Just an example on the bottom right there, a plot like that showing percent clast versus percent copper, which at least for the upper half of the ore body tells you that the infill, the hydrothermal cement infill to that ore body is the thing that's making the ore body tick. So in other words, the brecciation processes are not passive, they're very much active and they very much control the ore grade. And so interpreting textures like that rock there becomes quite tricky, because in addition to hydrothermal cement, there's a lot of hydrothermal corrosion of the clasts themselves, and the deep parts of the ore body people have described as pseudobreccias for that reason. Those brecciation characteristics are actually quite interesting. So the red to yellow shades there basically represent the classification of the breccias according to the MIM logging, which is pretty robust. It's not that difficult to get it wrong within the ore body except in a couple of zones. So the red represents this matrix supported breccia, this cement supported breccia. The yellow represents the clast supported breccia, and then there's various ore grades there, copper and gold superimposed. And so again, you see a very close correlation between the breccia type and the ore grades within that particular system. One of the things that the codes guys have been keen on for a while is zapping minerals down to the nth degree and trying to use indicator elements within those minerals to try and track that. People have been looking at this in iron oxide copper gold deposits for quite some time now. The first paper that was published by some Canadians had a graph that classified 5 or 6 different magnetite bearing mineral types, ore body types, into different fields. And so it said this one skarn, this one porphyry, this one IOCG, this one whatnot. And the first work we did in Ernest Henry covered all of that diagram with Ernest Henry magnetites and extended beyond the bounds of what had been used to classify other magnetite types. So the difficulty with looking at magnetite chemistry is that there is some caution that needs to be exercised. Nonetheless, we had a PhD student work on this, and regrettably there's been nothing published from that PhD study. Occasionally you get PhD studies which have got wonderful intent, a good program of work that's focused on a clear target, and the result is too hard. So poor Dexian Zhang, a Chinese student, came and worked on magnetite chemistry, and at the end of his thesis, his conclusion was the magnetites are quite complicated. And since then, we've continued working on it, and we have got something out of it, and you'll have to believe me, and the reason why I drew that red line in there is to demonstrate, and you just have to believe me. We've got some more data, I'll show you some plots in a minute, but there is a core of manganese-rich magnetites, which is most prominent at depth within that ore body. It stays within the guts of the ore body and gets narrower towards the top, and the manganese content drops off to the side. But it wasn't that simple to work out what was actually controlling it. The plot on the right is a horrible statistical plot that shows the standard deviation of the manganese content of the magnetites from individual thin sections. And that's the horrible part, because the standard deviation is a lot broader than the actual range that we're using to show you the plot on the left. But the standard deviation itself ended up being quite an interesting parameter, because the hot colours there show you that the higher up in the ore body, the noisier the magnetite chemistry becomes. And we believe that that's important. So there is something in it. It took us a really, really long time to try and suss out. But if you look at so if we're thinking of this thing as a pipe, so we've got a core that goes from top to bottom, and we've got flanks that go from top to bottom, or bottom to top the way I just did it. And you actually do see a difference, but you can see the data is pretty horrible and overlappy. But if you focus on these plots on the right, you can see that the flanks of the ore body, the magnetites tend to become more vanadium rich. There's a trend towards aluminium, which we think is aluminium that's being incorporated into the manganese into the magnetites from interaction with the wall rock, but there's a shift from manganese-rich in the core and deep within the deposit to more vanadium-rich higher up in the deposit and on the flanks. Now, the question really is whether or not you could use that for a viable exploration criteria if you were to be randomly testing out magnetites from the district, and we did try to randomly test out the magnetites from the district, and I guess the answer is that for an ore body size volume of magnetite that you might randomly find in the district, you have to do that amount of work to find out that it's complicated. So it's a potential topic for the future, but it's a thing that the codes guys are now going to be faced with when they come in here trying to use their successful epidote chemistry method for porphyries on the different types of magnetic ironstones within the eastern fold belt. It'll be tough, but possible. Okay, so normally I'd be talking a lot more about the ore deposition model, but I can't here due to time. It is a complicated ore body, but there is a primary structural and lithological control. We can very simply represent these rocks on one side as being representative of the Corella Formation, and very simply representing the rocks on the right-hand side as the Soldier's Cap. That's not strictly true. It's much more complicated than that. But the ore body, as most people that have worked on it know, has developed on a bend in 2D and 3D, and there's an early stage of proximal iron potassium alteration superimposed upon sodic calcic alteration. So there's ingredients on the edge of that ore body that look like they're relatively long-lived, in particular this biotite magnetite alteration, which forms one of the distinct exploration halos that I'll talk about in a second. But the main ore body itself, and this is the bit I won't go into details, looks like it's been developed by interaction between what was probably a reasonably fast-moving diatreme-like pipe that interacted with that structural environment to produce a shattered zone that subsequently moved around quite a lot, and clasts were gradually being lifted up within that pipe towards the upper domain. This is occurring probably at about 5 kilometres depth, and it probably had some connection to the surface. It's hard to imagine that it didn't. But the main thing about that ore body is we believe, well, okay, I believe, some others do, I haven't convinced many people, that there's an interaction between very high energy transported breccia processes and that ore body. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is from Rick's, is this finalised now, Rick, or is this still the draft version? Okay, so this is from the mineral deposit atlas that Rick and co have been working on, and that shows more or less all of the alterations superimposed upon a plan view of the Ernest Henry ore body. So I want to try and pull some key factors out of that. The work that Geordie Mark did more or less simplified that into 2 key ingredients. The pink outline there is strong albertization that was talked about just briefly just now, and the yellow is the more ore proximal alteration, mostly defined by enrichments in potassium, iron and manganese. The ironstones are shown with this black stipple pattern, and I guess the key thing there, if you looked at other ironstones elsewhere in the district, they may or may not be surrounded by both those alteration types with an arrangement like that. So one of the features that we think is probably important, and people have said this before, is a transition from albite into potassic alteration in proximity to Ernest Henry. And that is a vector that people probably haven't specifically used, and the challenge, of course, in the district is that there are albitites, 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 and albitites. They actually, we now know that they spanned pretty well the entire history of, right from the deposition of the Corella Formation right up to the last gasp of the Williams batholith, so that these albitites are developing over 250 million years. So this albitite, we believe, was probably immediately pre-Ernest Henry and may actually have been associated with the Ernest Henry ore-forming environment. So there is work to be done on these albitites. Because this one is plausibly part of the lateral outflow from the Ernest Henry core system, but people have previously described these albitites as simply being mechanically suitable rocks within which you would fracture up and make some mineralisation. So I think there is work worthwhile continuing on albitites that are proximal and distal to these IOCG systems. The other thing that Geordie Mark did, very simple maps, but I believe, I don't know how much this is in 3D, I guess not that much, and that would be a good thing to get into because it's possible, is that the signal of the ore body in plan view from copper contours is obviously less than the signal you get from iron, which relates to the magnetic ironstones. But the other signal that I don't think has been used regionally very much, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a big manganese signal in all rocks surrounding Ernest Henry, which is quite distal to the core of that particular system. So I think if you flip back through those three things there, you'll see it. Sulfides and copper, iron and manganese, and you can see a halo effect there. And I don't know whether that manganese to iron transition has been specifically used. You'd obviously have to normalise it for different rock types because you've got things like the overhang jasperite in the way elsewhere in the district. Geophysical signals and prospectivity has been touched on a little bit before by previous speakers, but I will touch on it in passing. This is old work. Pat Williams, when the first geophysical data was found, this is how half these IOCGs were discovered, as you all know, pointed out that there's ironstones and there's ironstones. So not only do we have sedimentary ironstones that are mineralised or unmineralised, we have metasomatic ironstones that are mineralised or unmineralised. So 4 basic types of fundamental ironstone classification. And when you look at the known deposits, those you do with geophysical understanding will recognise what these colours mean. That basically means that the mag, gravity and electrical signals of these different deposit types vary depending on which target you're looking at. And the Ernest Henry type is probably the worst because it's coincident mag and sulfides. Not enough sulfides potentially to be well picked up with electrical methods, although I'm not sure about that, Rick and Paul. Was it okay electric? Supergene was good, yeah. But you see the problem there. So if you're looking for Ernest Henry style deposits, what does that actually mean? And I didn't have enough time to have this conversation with Rick about this part of the talk because these are not all Ernest Henry style deposits. Ernest Henry is an Ernest Henry style deposit. And Mount Elliott is a bit close, I guess, and Mount Dore a bit close. Stara, Osborne and Eloise I would stick into another bucket, which I'm going to talk about in a second. We've heard about the gravity and the gravity data. I think this is GA's data, shows that all of these deposits lie on significant gravity gradients, but as the previous speaker mentioned, even with data at this resolution, you're still struggling to use that for specific targeting. And people have already anyway gone up and down these gravity gradients, drilling whatever they possibly can that's got a magnetic blip on it. The other thing that's in Rick's, Rick talked about this yesterday, there was a big effort done on the prospectivity of these things, and here's all the criteria that I think, Rick, you must have gone through a little bit yesterday. And these are interesting, but some of them are impossible undercover. I think you ruled out rock chips and radiometrics because you couldn't get the information undercover. And everybody knows that they're on magnetic highs, so you can sort of exclude some of these things on the basis that they're impossible undercover or that they've been done to death. So where is the significance of that prospectivity analysis? But of course this was done with a training data set. This was simply to identify which combination of layers would best give you prospectivity for IOCGs, but not specific to Ernest Henry. Nonetheless, the results and the PMD CRC finished with such well, I won't say kerfuffle, it was just finished in such a rush that the product delivery was certainly, there was not a program within the PMD CRC called adequate project delivery, much to our subsequent regret. But anyway, the outcome there of this prospectivity analysis with those 10, 15 and 5 layer things was a number of things that picked up most of the deposits as well as some prospects. But nonetheless, I don't think that this has been used as much as it could have been, and part of that's because it hasn't been appropriately publicly located in an environment where people have been able to use it as much as they should have, and that's been available for more than 10 years. Okay, so one of the things that Ernest Henry sits in is a structural corridor, and these structural corridors are absolutely crucial for exploration. And again, most people that have worked in the Mount Isa block will be fully aware of this. There's no point looking in the middle of a big blob of stuff that doesn't have faults or shears running through it, because most of the ore bodies are fault and shear zone hosted. Now, so what are these corridors and how and where are they defined? They're not easy to auto-define, so Tom Blenkinsop and Jim Austin had a go at trying to auto-characterise the relationship between orientations and lengths of particular fault segments, and the copper prospectivity, and it sort of worked with the gold deposits, it sort of worked with the gold-copper deposits, it sort of worked reasonably well with the copper-gold deposits that you did not call IOCGs, and guess which family it didn't work particularly well with, and the family, of course, is Ernest Henry type IOCGs, where it was not easy from their data set at least to extract automatically information that related to targeting on the basis of orientation and length of fault segments, which was this attempt that was published by them in All Geology Reviews. But I would recommend you have a look at that. That's a very interesting paper. The key thing that they picked up, that again people have picked up from geophysical reasons as well, is this Cloncurry worm or Cloncurry lineament, major boundary between this package of rocks to the west and package of rocks to the east, which host a significant number of the deposits, at least within the radius or buffer zone around that significant geophysical anomaly. So I'm going to change tack a little bit slightly and think about a little bit more on some rocks. If you go into the banks of the Cloncurry River, not too far from Ernest Henry, near Mount Fort Constantine, you see one of the key structural features that I now believe is reasonably important for the exploration effort, and that is the presence of discordant polymictic fluidized breccias. And an example shown here, and this example on the right shows a boundary. On the right-hand side here, we have a transition from a stockwork into a crackle breccia, into a mosaic breccia, and then a fairly hard boundary within which, this is all Mount Fort Constantine volcanic, so this is the same host rock as Ernest Henry, and we're about 15 k's away from Ernest Henry. Some of these veins you can actually line up and measure them and they point straight towards Ernest Henry. I wouldn't recommend using that as an exploration criteria, however. But when you get into this breccia, you see magnetite, cement, polymictic clast. Some of those clasts are Mount Fort Constantine, some of them are quite exotic. Let's take a slightly closer look. So those breccias, and we've now been able to recognise these breccias in the field, you tend not to be able to easily recognise them initially, because when you first see them, if you've had a full breakfast and a night on the piss the night before, sorry, that's going to go in the recording, if you're feeling slightly queasy, when you see these rocks, they kind of, they might make your stomach a little bit upset, and you might want to walk away from them and quietly throw up in the corner. But if you're a breccia lover, these are fantastic rocks. Polymictic, as you can see, there's clasts of, in fact, there's even magnetite clasts floating within this magnetite matrix. And sorry, there's another slide there, it's coming up in a minute. And the whole point about that is you can see this transition from fragmentation on the walls into progressive destruction of the rock, and then the fragments take off. Now, those people that have worked in porphyry epithermal environments will be used to these type of things, because you can see the same sort of things every time you get a phreatic or phreatomagmatic eruption in the porphyry epithermal environment, and these discordant pipes in porphyries sometimes host substantial mineralisation. And pipes, of course, elsewhere in North Queensland, like Kidston, etc., are pipes with this textural style. If we look at these breccias regionally, they actually are found all the way up and down the belt, and I'll show you a map in a minute. But some of the mapping of these things is truly stunning. You look at that map on the right, and you wouldn't be at all surprised if that was an igneous dike. You wouldn't even blink. But that is not an igneous dike. That is inverted commas, a dike that is made up of 95% metasedimentary clasts, and the metasedimentary clasts come from the formation that is underneath this schist. So that's basically an explosive pipe or sheet that's come out the top of that Saxby granite, the so-called Suicide Ridge breccia. Mike Rubinek impolitely named that when he was trying to stop a Japanese student. It was a very depressed Japanese student that was actually talking about suicide with him in the field when they were looking at these rocks. And so Mike talked him out of suiciding, at least he thinks he talked him out of suiciding, but then nonetheless this ridge was named Suicide Ridge. Sorry about that little bit of inappropriate comments. Anyway, there's Suicide Ridge. Those of you that have been to see it will know what I'm talking about. The most spectacular one is the Gilded Rose breccia type locality. This is a 1 by 1 kilometre diatreme-like breccia that contains bundies of corella formation in it as big as this stage I'm standing on and bigger, and that diatreme completely, utterly cuts the Soldier's Cap group. In fact, you can walk the foliation along these lines like this and walk it straight into this breccia. And that breccia's got a razor-sharp contact and is completely stuffed full of fragments of corella formation rocks, which are the underlying sequence. So if you saw a map like this in Arizona or New Mexico around Ship Rock, you're in the middle of a diatreme field. These are quite spectacular rocks. The reason I'm going on about them, so here's that example from the riverbed again, and again these look like sort of, bits of bad tradie back garden cementing of a bad patio, but they're cemented by magnetite and actinolite, so they're quite interesting breccias. That breccia type you can find to the south. These are the ones that you can map in the field, and some magnetite, quite a lot of magnetite. This is the Ernest Henry ore body. So texturally you can see that there's a distinct relationship. Ernest Henry has mostly monomictic, but nonetheless fluidized breccias. Some of the breccias within Ernest Henry are polymictic, as you can see from this one here, cemented by magnetite and chalcopyrite, which is the thing I would normally be talking about in an even more animated way than this. Okay, so here's the deposits, the main deposits running up and down that belt. The triangles are a small subset of these discordant breccias that we've discovered or found. You can actually see them in part on some map sheets. They were originally mapped as a sedimentary blanket of Corella Formation sitting on the top, leaving behind remnant islands. That's how the BMR mapped them in the 60s and 70s. Turns out those islands are pipes that are punched up like that, not dissimilar to some of the landforms that Carl Spandler showed earlier on with the rare earths. But so you can see that they're sitting in an interesting location. They're running along the Cloncurry fault, heading up towards Ernest Henry, and we don't think it's any coincidence about the distribution of those breccias. I'll finalise that in a minute. The other thing I should mention, Ernest Henry type IOCGs, what are they? One of the things that's now more or less published is a distinction between IOCG types, and this will probably set off a few arguments, and Helen's telling me I'm late. That's okay, John, you only wanted to talk for 20 minutes, didn't you? Yeah. 20? Yeah, okay. So I've got 3 more minutes. I'm almost finished, sort of. Anyway, so that there's two categories of IOCGs. They're not all the same thing. The model that originally came out of JCU was that they were all related to Williams-Narracoo batholith. That's not true. There's a family of ones that are Ernest Henry-like, which we'll call breccia IOCGs, and that the line I've drawn between these two domains probably overlaps quite a bit, and I've continued to refine it. But most of the IOCGs sitting in the belt over here up to Rocklands, up to Ernest Henry, and several of the ones near Selwyn, Mount Elliott, would be regarded as Syn Williams batholith and mostly breccia related. There's a family of ones that I call basinal IOCGs, potentially related to Broken Hill type rocks at Cannington, and that firmly includes Osborne, although Osborne's been modified substantially enough later for a fair bit of the copper to be sitting in young structural traps. I think Eloise is probably in that family as well. Okay, so very quickly, those discordant breccias I was showing you about, and this needs to be tested because I'm not sure of this myself, I don't have enough data. There's a suggestion that the magnetite matrix content of those discordant breccias increases towards the north as you head towards Ernest Henry and Rocklands. That needs to be tested. I'm really unsure of that. The magnetite content is palpable, so you can actually map these on the geophysics down here. If you've got low magnetic schists and these things punch through the low magnetic schist, you can see them on the mag, and that magnetite content does seem to increase as you head towards the ore bodies. Over what scales that's appropriate to be then using as a search weapon, I'm not quite sure. John McClellan will talk in the next talk about geomechanical modelling for Ernest Henry type deposits, and within Ernest Henry, the work we did with GSQ funding several years ago, which was much appreciated at the time. We were both a bit broke back then, but the modelling actually brings up a whole bunch of ways in which you can use a geomechanical simulation of fault arrays to try and pick up zones of prospectivity, and we think that this is one of the key steps forward to be continuing with this work, particularly trying to take this type of output data and mix it with the other types of data available. And so that's a little a thing from a talk I gave in Canada where I think I titled the talk Chaos and Control. Those of you old enough to remember Get Smart will instantly appreciate that. But anyway, these corridors simply show in pink and in green John McClellan's results from a series of geomechanical exercises which pick up the high failure potential for 2 stages of the Mount Isa late orogenic history, D4 in green and D3 in pink. And you can see that this set of results coincides at least reasonably well, first order, firstly with the distribution of the known deposits, and secondly, they seem to host most of the, or at least some of the discordant breccias that I was just talking to you about. Okay, summary now. My 27 minutes is up, 28. If we think about now from sublime to ridiculous, if you like, easy or done at the top to what is the potential for the future with respect to exploration for this type of deposit. We assume proximity to the Williams batholith. A lot of that prospectivity work that was done by the PMD CRC verified things that people have already known and basically just specified that, but they're talking about corridors that have got 1 kilometre wide buffers or 750 metre wide buffers, or a corridor in which you're looking for proximity to mafic rocks over 750 metres. There's not too many parts of the Mount Isa inlier where you can walk more than 750 metres without coming across a mafic rock. So some of these ones up the top are kind of a given, but they need to be considered in any exploration model anyway, as per the previous talk we heard about the inversion of the mag and the gravity. The right structural corridors, well, I've given you a hint as to what those right structural corridors are. Can other corridors like that be found undercover? I'm not sure. This one may be controversial, but I believe that the presence of these diatreme-like breccias is important regionally, because I believe that process is also related to the process that is at least one of the major contributors to the formation of Ernest Henry. Geomechanical modelling, the work that John and I have done, it's a matter of the input is absolutely crucial, and Paul and Rick will know this. If you simplify the input too much, you get very simplified results. If you complicate the input too much, then you're really questioning exactly what the details of those inputs are all the time. Key point is you get better and better results that are more and more precise with respect to predicting known mineralisation as you zoom into more detailed scales. I believe that this is one of the ways that we can move forward that represents something between the bleeding obvious and the semi-insane in terms of future prospectivity. I believe that there's work to be done on the albertization regionally with this focus in mind. There's been a lot of work done on the albertization, but we haven't actually classified that alteration in terms of does it relate to Ernest Henry style IOCGs. And it's taken a lot of work to even get to the point where we can even ask that question. Manganese and potassium anomalism, rock normalised, is something that I don't know whether is viable. Obviously still requires you've got access to rock chips, and so you're probably better off looking for copper and gold, but maybe there are signals existing within the known geochemical databases in which manganese has actually been analysed, and this could be done. Magnetite chemistry, if you're persistent, I guess would be the most polite way to mention, and a bunch of things I didn't mention which also relate to the details that you might be able to pull out of the mineral chemistry that may provide future vectors. And I better leave it at that.
Thank you, Nick.